thank you, everyone, for coming over on a rainy day. And it's not a great spectacle watching a man in a suit in a stuffy town talk yet again and yet more about foreign policy. But before I begin, I have to say thank you not only to all of you, but thank you to Rebecca Brighton, who made this all possible. Rebecca, you can raise your hand if you want to. That's her. Thank you to Stephen Brathwaite, the extremely elegant, dapper, balding man sitting in the back row with a shining bait, with the eminence, around his visage like a halo, almost like Jesus. But thank you to Stephen Brathwaite. Thank you to Udit Thakur, who's been helping us with a lot of things. You can raise your hand. You're not shy. Come on, go on, raise your hands. Yeah, he, unlike Stephen, has a full flock of hair. He's in the prime of his youth and is wrestling to boot as well. So a representative of a virile part of India called Punjab. Is that correct? Himachal, okay. Once a part of Punjab, but now its own state. They got rid of the shackles of the evil Punjabis, right? No, they're not quite evil, but anyway. And of course, we don't have other people here, so I don't need to thank them, except I'm on camera, so I do need to thank three people. I need to thank Professor Devesh Kapoor of the Center of Advanced Study of India, who sent me a ton of reading material, not all of which was helpful, but it still, helped me prepare somewhat for this talk. So thank you, Devesh. I have to thank Ambassador Sally Shelton-Colby, who had me over in a talk in the room above. Professor Surjit Mansingh, who invited me for the first time here, and I'm forgetting the name, but now I'm not. I have to thank the University chaplain, Joseph Eldridge, who sent me a fantastic card after organizing a great event at the chapel. So I think I am done with thank yous now. And of course, it is a huge relief, because now I can get into talking and be slightly more improper, because you have to be proper when you're thanking people. So, this, as I said, this is a town besotted with the here and now, with the immediate. It is a town that now functions probably on the time cycle of Twitter. And it is a town very fond of fancy words like policy. I don't even know what that means. I mean, I sort of do, but I don't, it's a lukewarm word, like porridge. You're supposed to eat it when you're really young or really old, when your teeth are not quite formed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring you in a town of little history in terms of consciousness, not in terms of reality, and little color, at least in terms of discourse. I'm going to bring you a sense of history and spice, both of which happen to be a part of my heritage and a part of me. So, without further ado, let us get into the meat of the matter. What I propose to do is that I propose to talk about Indo-US relations through three prisms. And the three prisms are, first, politics, or first, actually, history. Second, politics, and third, economics. In my mind, international relations or international studies or whatever it is called in different schools is a fancy word which is nothing but applied history, politics, and economics. Because those are the fundamentals on which all international studies, all international relations rest. And often they get lost in modern academic jargon, or modern, let's say, State Department jargon, or modern foreign ministry jargon, or whatever the jargon is. So let us look at history. And as I speak, there is a gentleman walking in who used to be a history professor. He's going to come straight on in, and his name is, let's take his name as he enters the room. His name is Francis Flavin. Francis Flavin used to be a history professor, and it's very appropriate he should walk in when I'm talking about the first point, history. And we begin with the history of India. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you tales of the hoary past. It's too long a country. I mean, it's not too long a country. It's too old a country. But maybe not. India is an ancient civilization, but a very young nation. There is a bit of a contradiction there. Maybe, but not quite. India is a bit like Europe, with its manifold regions, all with a separate identity. And unlike Europe, it doesn't even have a common script. So you've got n number of different scripts, and the southern languages are from the Dravidian school, the northern languages are closer to German and French and English than to the southern languages. So it is an experiment when it comes to nation building. It is a nation of unique diversity, not just in terms of language, but in terms of religion. Whether it is Parsis who fled the Zoroastrians, who fled Iran as Zoroastrians when Islam came to Iran, to Syrian Christians who've been on the west coast of India in Kerala from the 1st century AD, to the Sikhs, to the Jains who've been there since 6th century BC, to the innumerable number of sects of what is broadly termed Hinduism, but each region has its own god. Actually, each village has its own god, and families, husbands and wives and children will worship different deities. So as an outsider, India is a conundrum wrapped in a riddle, wrapped in an enigma, to shamelessly plagiarize from Churchill perhaps, or whoever else who said that. But the diversity of India is extraordinary, and it makes it difficult to deal with the country. And this country, when it was under British colonial rule, and this is where history is important, this country, when it was under British colonial rule, looked to America as an exemplar to create a new political system, to fight for its independence, and to create a new society. In 1885, when the Indian National Congress first convened, the word Congress was chosen for a reason. It is not an Indian word. It is a word taken from the Congress that drafted the Constitution of this country in 1776. Not the discredited Congress now, where people don't turn up from Capitol Hill because they are perhaps too busy drinking. But, the Congress, which had people like Jefferson, which had extraordinary great minds, which forged a nation against a dominant imperial power, the like of which the world has never seen, or had never seen. So that was the burning inspiration for the Indian freedom movement. As the freedom movement progressed, there were naturally more left-leaning ideas that permeated the Indian consciousness in a land of much poverty. That was obvious. But yet, the link with the US was strong. The Dandi March, the famous Dandi March in which Gandhi marched to the sea and broke the salt laws and was much mythified or much eulogized. And it is iconic. It is an iconic symbol of resistance. That was covered by an American reporter. So the ties of the US and India go deep and go long. After independence, Nehru took over. Sardar Patel and Mahatma Gandhi, the two stalwarts of India's independence, said that the Indian National Congress ought to have been disbanded. The party, which had fought for India's freedom, was a movement, and it ought not to be reduced to a party. Unfortunately, these two gentlemen died a touch too early. Gandhi was assassinated barely a few months after independence. Patel died early as well. By 1950, he was dead after unifying India. Under Nehru, who was a Fabian socialist, who went to Harrow and never really spoke his own language well, India went through a leftward lilt. Mark the alliteration. I could have said leftward drift, but leftward lilt sounds better. And it was a leftward lilt. India was still democratic. Nehru, to his credit, was a great intellectual. He was well-meaning. But he imposed upon India the protectionism, the beginnings of what India would call the license control Raj, the oppressive overhang of a British bureaucracy overlaid with socialist regulation. India would begin life with a Hindu rate of growth. India would also, in its foreign policy, adopt a grandiose, non-aligned movement, a product of Fabian socialism, not entirely in line with either economic or political reality. And the two other people who started this with Nehru were of course, Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia, which doesn't exist, and of course, let me remember, it was, pardon me? Nasser from Egypt, and of course, the big player was Indonesia as well at the time. Yeah. It was
Nehru, Nasser, and Tito.
Tito were the ones. Nasser who started, and Yugoslavia has imploded, and Egypt is in dire straits, and of course, India didn't do that well under Nehru either. But the leftward lilt, the leftward lilt in India, and let me back up a little bit. When I said I'm going to talk about history, let me give it structure, which I didn't give it structure. Indian history can be catalogued into 3 periods. When it comes to Indo-US relations, US history can be catalogued into 3 periods. So for Indian history, the 3 periods would be the Nehru period, the Indira Gandhi period, and post-Indira period, and the third would be the post-1991 market reforms period. Those are the 3 broad suites in which you can catalog Indo-US relations when you look at the legacy of history. For the US, it would be the Cold War period, which lasts till 1991. The second period would be the post-Cold War period, or the La La Land period, 1991 to 2001, when Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history and America was the glorious superpower. And the third period would be the post-9/11 period, a period of much soul-searching, much angst, of political and economic strife, of a search, a renewed search for the soul of a nation which is in angst. So let's get on with the first period of India. So the leftward lilt didn't set India off to a right start. At least that is my opinion. And it is not the dominant opinion because, of course, the dominant opinion is the one which is pro-dynastic because it's still in power till today. So the second period, when Nehru left office, or Nehru dies and his successor, Lal Bahadur Shastri, dies, is when Indira Gandhi takes over power. And when Indira took over power, that leftward lilt became a leftward lurch. Indira was far more close to the Soviets. India moved dramatically to the left. In fact, there are some dates here which I don't remember off the top of my head, but in July 1969, Indira nationalized the banks. In 1971, after the war against Pakistan over East Pakistan, which then created a new country called Bangladesh, was won, someone called General Premendra Singh Bhagat, a glorious officer of the Indian Army, was superseded for a flunky. By 1971, Indira was already ensuring that all institutions of the state apparatus were subordinated, and the only thing that counted was personal loyalty. Competence was thrown out of the window. Corruption was fine. As long as you went and kissed the hem of Indira's sari, you were in power. You were a benefit of her patronage. And you benefited from her patronage. The bureaucracy was decimated, the police was decimated, the military was decimated, the judiciary was interfered with, and finally, in 1974, Indira tried to do away with democracy itself. She put the entire opposition in prison and imposed the emergency. And what happened thereafter was an even greater leftward lurch, because the 1976 amendment of the Constitution, the 42nd Amendment, at a time when everyone Indira disliked was rotting in jail, changed the preamble of the country. The country, which had hitherto been a sovereign democratic republic, was now called a sovereign socialist secular democratic republic. Two new words were inserted in the preamble: socialist and secular. The reason the former was inserted was because Indira wanted to be seen as pro-poor. It was a populist measure. It was also an ideological measure, because she was drifting towards the Soviet Union. And two, the word secular was inserted because Indira was currying votes from the large Muslim minority. And so it was a very strong, sloganeering signal that she was the great repository and defender of minority rights. And if you want to understand India, you have to realize that those two words still stand in the Constitution today. As per the preamble, India is still a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. The 42nd Amendment in 1976, at a time when India wasn't even democratic, is still a part of our Constitution, or the preamble to our Constitution. So, the Indira era was clearly not going to be extremely beneficial when it came to Indo-US ties, as you could now guess from what I've told you. Post-1991, the third period, post-1991, Soviet Union collapsed. India was on the brink of bankruptcy. The IMF led a bailout after India pledged 67 tons of gold to the Union Bank of Switzerland and the Bank of England. That's pretty dire straits. It's ironic that the current Prime Minister and the then Prime Minister took all the credit for it, and the IMF stood in the shadows because they didn't want accusations of this being a foreign-led reform process. But the fact of the matter is that had it not been for the dire economic crisis, and had it not been for the IMF-led reforms, and for once the IMF did do a good job, India would still have been languishing under the Hindu rate of growth. So why have I given you this history? I've given you this history because history matters. You have to understand that Indo-US relation or US-India relations have been poisoned by ideology right from the outset. And this will be evident to you, especially as I delineate US history. Now, the US position till 1991 was one defined by the Cold War. As I told you, three periods: Cold War period, the 10-year la-la land, 1991 to 2001, and the post-9/11 period. So the Cold War period is one where the US looked at things blindly through the prism of ideology, and sometimes it led to mistakes, like in Iran in 1953, like supporting the South African apartheid regime, because the ANC was deemed socialist, and it was more left-wing. But other factors like justice, democracy, rights, human rights didn't factor in. Allende was dismissed and Pinochet was installed. And some of these decisions arguably panned out for the better, and some of them panned out for the worse. But what it did at the time is that because the US was operating through this prism of ideology, and because Pakistan joined its various alliances, India was deemed an ideological, if not an enemy, an ideological adversary. It was not quite the Soviet Union, but it was leading a non-aligned movement and not quite conducive to US interests. So the phase till 1991, and it is one that is defined by deep suspicion. And a point to note is that both parties played a hand in furthering and strengthening the suspicion on both sides. So the US support of Pakistan, which was an aggressor towards India on many occasions, led to Indian paranoia, almost. It's a strong word, but I would say there were times when Indians were almost paranoid. And India's leftward lurch, especially under Indira Gandhi, and especially staying silent when the Soviets marched into Afghanistan, also led to US discomfort. And so what you were seeing was both these countries at odds, at complete odds, almost. Not quite at war, but with no level of trust. 1991 onwards, the post-1991 to 2001 period, is when the economic reforms in India opened up the market. And this is a time when India almost vanished from the US radar. It appeared in 1998 when there were nuclear explosions. And of course, Clinton famously, maladroitly, the Clinton administration, not quite maybe President Clinton, but the Clinton administration famously, maladroitly mishandled the situation, creating more distrust. In fact, the whole 1998, the sanctions, the potent sanctions of the Clinton administration, followed by, accompanied by the language used, made the Indian security establishment very uneasy. Indians were so afraid of US reprisal initially that they didn't even tell their own ambassador here, and they didn't even tell members of their foreign service about the forthcoming nuclear explosions, because they didn't want the news to leak to the US, and they feared that the US intelligence operatives, the CIA, would figure out and find out, and all hell would break loose. So that period, whilst you have an easing and lessening of tension, is still a bumpy one. And post 9/11 for the US, this is the third period, post 9/11 things change, because all of a sudden you have an attack in Manhattan, an attack in Washington, DC, or let's say Virginia, in the Pentagon, an attack on the most potent symbols of the US state. Never before had the American mainland, since the Brits left, maybe in 1812, which is the last time there was a bit of a war and action on US mainland, the American continent, had America been attacked. Pearl Harbor happened in Hawaii. Suddenly you had this huge churning, this huge insecurity, and of course, an intervention in India's backyard, or India's neighborhood in Afghanistan. That intervention and the focus of the Bush administration on finding democratic allies led to a rapprochement beginning in 2005, leading to a civilian nuclear deal in 2008, and led to very close relationships between the two countries by historical standards. And so today we stand with that historical legacy wherein there has been a long period of distrust, but the rapprochement has just begun. The elements of institutional engagement, the elements of civil nuclear deals, the elements of a closer political engagement have just started. But the process is very new, and the process is still marred with a fair degree of reticence and distrust. partly of course, because those in power in New Delhi and Washington, D.C. still have the residual. In Washington, D.C., it's the Cold War mindset. And in Delhi, the people who are in power are still the Congress party. They are still the die-hard socialists at heart. Pranab Mukherjee, who was the erstwhile foreign minister of India, has been notoriously muddled in his thinking and left-wing, and he's a product of Indira's era. So to expect a new chapter in Indo-US relations is almost a little too early. But a beginning has been made. One of the things that now I'd like to do is move on to the second issue. Now that I have given you a historical legacy on both sides of the globe, let's talk about the second issue, politics. And I'm of the firm opinion here that at heart, the policies of a state are driven by the internal politics within their respective countries' electorate. And let me rephrase it better. The politics of a particular country are local. Foreign policy is often an outcome of the internal domestic policies. And if you look at the US, the times when the US has shown great statesmanship have also been times when there has been some agreement on some common points when it comes to domestic politics. When foreign policy stopped at the shore, for want of a better word. Truman went through the Marshall Plan. Eisenhower came in and actually backed it to the hilt. And not just that, followed a process of consolidation and deepening of alliances and strengthening of NATO. And so it didn't matter if you had a Democrat or a Republican. The interstate highways were built. It didn't matter whether it was a Republican president actually who did it. People forget that. It was a Republican president who warned the people of America about a military-industrial complex. And that is the sort of mindset that leads to great foreign policy. When you live in a syndrome, as you do today in Washington, D.C., I call it the ADD syndrome. A friend of mine who retired as a senior officer of the CIA said that people give us far too much credit. Oftentimes, we don't even have the concentration to tie up our shoelaces, and we keep tripping up on our faces. But everything that happens in the world is often deemed to be a CIA conspiracy. If only that were true. And the fact is, yes, if only that were true. The fact of the matter is that in DC, as I said, you live in Twitter cycles. You live in what's going to benefit my popularity. You live in a continuous election cycle. You have constant posturing, obviously aided and abetted by the media, not by us, by the mainstream media. But that means that you cannot have a long-term strategic engagement, and that impairs on relationships which are complex, like India. It is easier to deal with other countries which have been allies. Even there, it's not ideal. But it's particularly difficult when you're dealing with a country with the complexity of India. In India, on the other hand, you have dynastic rule. So you have this enormous insularity when it comes to the top leadership. You have all these loyalists to the dynasty, which are dinosaurs, who actually should have been buried, but are still moving around and in the corridors of power. And they have the same insularity and the same mentality of patronage. And there is a posturing mindset. Indian politics is fractious. The dynasty is weakening. So there's a lot of posturing. Oh, we uphold national sovereignty. And what is the best way to do it? By claiming to stand up against the only superpower, or by claiming to be sturdily independent of the great superpower. And that doesn't lend itself to rational, to what the economists would call, a term that I don't particularly like, but it sometimes is useful, called utility maximizing outcomes, or efficient outcomes. So you get posturing on one side ADD on the other side, and there isn't enough engagement. There isn't enough engagement, not just politically in terms of institutional terms, but there isn't even a social engagement or an intellectual engagement of the political establishments. So you look at the think tank scene in Delhi, and you look at a lot of events, and I went to one of them. I went to the Washington Ideas Forum, and the one chap they had from the subcontinent was General Pervez Musharraf. And I was a little shocked, truth be told. I was thinking, yeah, you want to have good relations with India, really? And you're inviting the dictator who declared war on India in 1999 after overthrowing a democratically elected government in Kargil. Well, good luck. So my question is, if you're organizing things like the Washington Ideas Forum, why don't you have Ratan Tata? Why don't you have people from business? Why don't you have people from Indian intellectual circuit? Or for want of a better word, I mean, to use a better word, from the Indian intelligentsia. Why don't you call a great Indian scientist? I mean, India has a lot of physicists. That's what Indians do. They do math and science. They're good at it. You know, you'll rest assured you'll get a quality world-class speaker. Or call someone who's a venture capitalist. Or call someone who is into new technology. That's also something Indians do pretty well. So the point is, you don't have an engagement in this town which is either institutional or interpersonal. And so you have this huge gulf, this huge chasm of communication, of understanding. And that impairs both these countries, whether it is trade talks which collapsed at Doha, wherein a certain Indian minister called Kamal Nath, who is highly arrogant and incompetent, and a potent combination of both, did not play an inconsiderable role. India's interests could have been guarded much better than the grandstanding he did. Climate change talks, there could be more give and take there. India is now an innovative country with lots going on, at least in the technology space. There is a lot of cheap innovation going on, whilst US is the leader in innovation. And there's a lot to profit in engaging at that level too. But because you don't have that understanding, there is the friction, and there is a lack of ability to reach a closer accommodation. Obviously, different states have different interests. But good foreign policy or good relations mean that you're able to talk about and work through those differences and come to an optimal outcome, which is a win-win for both parties. That is still a far cry. So now I will talk about the two elephants in the room, not one. Well, we've already talked about the one elephant. I'll talk about two. The other one has not been talked about. And I will talk about it in terms of push and pull. And this is not internal politics, this is external politics, which plays a role in internal politics, but is mainly external politics. So the two elephants in the room are Pakistan and China. So China pushes India and the US closer, because the political elites in both countries are terrified of the rise of the dragon. To my mind, they're both slightly paranoid. They would do well if they learned a little bit of Chinese and talked to the Chinese. The Chinese are not green-eyed monsters. I just have come from the MIT China Innovation and Entrepreneurship Forum conference. And it was one of the most well-organized and most stimulating of conferences. The energy, the ambition, the engagement, the dialogue that was there in that conference, and the modesty, and just the curiosity that was there is often missing, even from a conference on India, which is a thriving democracy. So China is one of those countries that is exciting fear in India, partly because India got defeated badly in 1962. Our glorious great Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was to a great degree responsible for it. It was both rising Chinese ambition as well as a little bit of Indian intransigence that led to the clash. I think that clash could have been avoided had it been for more mature leadership. It wasn't. India lost. India lost badly and has had a fear psychosis since. China is rising. I would say it is just returning. It has always been a big power. The last 2 or 3 centuries are an aberration. It's just returning to play its role in the world. Yes, there are certain actions that are slightly threatening and alarming, but on the whole, it is not yet a malicious power. I don't think it will be. It has enough internal problems to solve. And I think that both the US and China, the US when it comes to the distant prospects of a challenger in the horizon with a strong rising economy and with a huge manufacturing base, is something that is often whipped up, especially amongst the popular press and even in elections. The US is scared because the US is going through a confidence crisis. The Indians are petrified. And so that, has pushed them together, but fear is always a bad start for good relations. On average, you need to sustain it on something more. And it's not as simplistic as that democracies are always aligned. And it is not as simplistic as, oh, US and India have common interests against China, because India and China have common interests when it comes to climate change, when it comes to trade, at least some issues on trade. And so the US, the Chinese and Indians have often got together when it suits them on various forums. The US, the Chinese and the Indians have commonalities when it comes to IMF reform, because they don't want to pay money to a European club, which is broke now. So the point is, it is, as most things, it is nuanced. So the push, the pulling them together factor, I think, is not based entirely in rationality, reason, and a long-term view. It is based in a long-term view, perhaps, of a certain view of the world, but in terms of long-term, hard-edged, basic interests going forward. And so it often leads to mismatched expectations. Now, the second issue of Pakistan, I already mentioned Pervez Musharraf. Now I'll talk about why Pakistan still continues to push India and the US away. It is because throughout its history, even as late as 1999, and this is 8 years after the market reforms, when Pakistan invaded India, this is under Pervez Musharraf, the US did not show sympathy, or the US did not show enough concern for Indian interests. And time again, the Indians have seen the US as a benefactor, a protector, and a funder of a country that promotes terror in their cities. Bomb blasts across different cities. Mumbai, of course, is well known. Attacks across the border. One could go on. But India sees Pakistan as a constant force of instability right at its border. And India has been concerned, alarmed, and disappointed at the lack of US understanding and support for its cause. Now that is gradually beginning to change as the US is bit by bit losing patience with Pakistan, bit by bit as the Pakistani elites do not control terror, as the Pakistani state sort of becomes more unstable, as Osama bin Laden is found not too far away from their elite military academy. So that process which is pushing them away is dwindling, but it is still there, because Pakistan still gets a lot of aid. Pakistan still has very close ties, at least social ties with the US, because Parvez Musharraf gets invited, but no Indian is invited in DC at a big forum. And so those are the two factors. And I would say that the pushing away factor also has to be talked through, and there has to be more understanding on both sides. There has to be more engagement between India and the US, and in terms of their interests in the region, because India is going to be the regional power there, and the US as a superpower and as a power wanting to control some amount of instability there and wanting to make sure it doesn't become a haven for terrorism will have interest there, regardless of whether it pulls troops out or not. And so all three have to talk on the table. But that is a complicating factor. Now I will talk about the third thing, and this for me is the most exciting thing. So far it's been boring things, and you've heard boredom, but politics, history, etc. Now let's talk about economics. I'm an entrepreneur, so it excites me, because I have to survive, right? If I don't understand economics, I'll go bankrupt and perhaps die, which, I want to go to heaven, but I'm not that much in a hurry yet. So let us look at economics. What has happened to Indo-US trade? Indo-US trade in 2010 was 19.25 billion. It was a mere 2 billion in 1991. It was actually 1.999, but let's round it up and say 2 billion. The growth, pretty much, has been extraordinary. Yes, it began from the low base, but the growth in trade is extraordinary. Let us look at foreign direct investment. US foreign direct investment in India was 16.1 billion in 2008. Indian foreign investment in the US, what most people don't know about, in 2007, I don't have figures for later, was 4.5 billion. Not insignificant. It created jobs. Suzlon, the wind turbine company. Tata owns hotels here. Steel, I could go on. But now you're seeing a reverse investment in this country. And so there is a great convergence when it comes to trade and investment. And I haven't even talked about institutional investment, indirect investment. So I could go on with facts and figures about different trade figures and how different subsectors have grown. But the point is, the investment figures in 1991 were insignificant because India was nearly broke and the US wasn't going to invest in India till then. So what has happened in investment is exponential. What has happened in trade is dramatic, staggering almost. Still low, but on the right track. But more importantly than the direct economic engagement between the two countries have been the great impact on their economies through indirect engagements. And this has benefited both countries. And now I will talk to you about the various fields in which this engagement has happened. And it has happened long before 1991. This has been going on since perhaps the 60s, if not the 50s. Education. The IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technology, were built on the model of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And the IITs and institutions of higher learning in India have supplied a lot of the top intellectual talent in this country. Hargobind Khurana, who won a Nobel Prize, was trained in my father's medical college, but came over here to do his research and earned the Nobel Prize. That is not an unquantifiable benefit to the USA. Chandrasekhar, who came up with the black holes, again an Indian who came to the US and became a leading physicist, and of course, won the Nobel Prize as well. I could go on with many, many, many names. But the point is, today in the US, you have Indian undergraduates in this university. You have Indian graduate students from IIT and other institutions of engineering and science, in MIT, in Carnegie Mellon, in Caltech. You have Indian doctors all over the place. You have business students from India. The entire business elite of India now comes to a business school here. Ratan Tata just gave away 50 million to Harvard Business School. Wharton, my alma mater, is known for its India connection. Stanford has a huge horde of entrepreneurial Indians who go there. Education is adding to value in both countries. Value here because some of the people who come here create companies. I have created a company here. Not yet quite amongst the wealthy yet, but maybe one day. But more importantly, the skills, the technologies, the mindsets, the new ways of doing business, that is a benefit to the US, the immigrant hunger. For India, the benefit is often when these people return, they take away the skills, they take away what they've learned from the US, and they often end up benefiting the companies that already exist by increasing their efficiency or increasing their innovation or improving their marketing or creating companies of their own. Science, I already alluded to it because it fits in with research. Fits in with education. Science, I will not belabor the point. Science is where a huge horde of people have come here and done extremely well, not just in universities, but in different companies, in different R&D positions. And it's all the way from Redmond in Microsoft and Boeing, which is near Redmond, up near Seattle, all the way down to Silicon Valley, and even in places like Houston, where Rice gets a lot of Indian engineers who do a lot of research in the petrochemicals and the oil industry. Technology, which is obvious because Silicon Valley is so full of Indians, and some of them have become extraordinary venture capitalists, some of them have become extraordinary entrepreneurs. Technology is where there are benefits. Again, it's two ways. Some set up companies here, then go back, like the founder of Hotmail, Sabir Bhatia, who's now in India. Some set up funds here, become venture capitalists, and then fund companies in India. The whole rise of Bangalore has been because of that connection with Silicon Valley. Services, I just alluded to Bangalore, so I'll have to talk about outsourcing and services. The rise of the services industry in India is because of the US. Yes, there are other markets too, but the US has been the driver of the Indian urban phenomenon, the call centers, the software program, and now even legal outsourcing. And one could go on. So I've already alluded to the numerous interlocked, intermeshed interests now between these two economies. In business, it is important to note that in the US now, it is Indians who are numbered second after Americans as CEOs of top companies. The CEO of Pepsi is an Indian woman. The CEO of SlideShare is an Indian woman. The CEO of Citigroup, of course, is also Indian. But more than that, it is the entrepreneurs, it is the innovators that have come here and set alight the economy in their own little way. And now, one of the things, because if you talk about America, you have to talk about entertainment, you have to talk about Hollywood, because what would America be without Hollywood? You know, I mean, they could fire the State Department, but they could not get rid of Hollywood. That does them a lot. That does this country a lot more good than the State Department. So let's talk about Hollywood. In the entertainment industry now, you're starting to see cross-linkages. Avatar, a film which was a super-duper hit. Avatar is a Sanskrit word which means incarnation. The very title is an Indian word. But what is not known, and probably more significant, is that a lot of the work for Avatar, the animation, was done in Mumbai or maybe some other place. And that interlinkage, that creative interlinkage has begun. Indian producers like Ashok Amritraj are operating in Hollywood, Hollywood studios are looking and eyeing the big Indian market because Indians love two things. They love to eat and they love watching films. If you can tap those two, you're in good shape. So if you start an ice cream parlor or you start a film, a cinema hall, you're going to be in pretty good shape. And so the point is, the engagement between these two countries is extraordinary. Every single business school is hosting an India conference. Every single major one, at least, that I know of. From Harvard to Stanford, from Wharton to Chicago. The deans of two business schools are Indian, Harvard and Chicago. So the point is that the rest of this country has economic, social, and cultural ties with India which are deep. In fact, the connection on Facebook between two countries that is the highest is India and the US. The UK and the US and the UK come second. And in our times of social networking, I think that says something. So, I leave you with the thought that while New York gets it, Hollywood is starting to get it. Atlanta with Coca-Cola obviously gets it. They are big in the Indian market, as is Pepsi. And Redmond and Silicon Valley definitely get it. The question I leave with you is, when will DC catch up? Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, do you guys have any questions? Go ahead, Francis.
Okay, you talked a little bit about India's great success in exporting top talent or using this top talent to help form linkages between the United States and India.
Yeah.
A couple of questions on that is one, where does that success come from? Is it the ethic of the people who are coming to America? Is it just in the numbers? Like, in other words, why do India and the United States why are they tops on Facebook? Is it just because we've got 1.2 billion in India and 300 million in the United States that makes it hard for any other country to compete? And the other question too is that when we is this bond that's forming between the United States and India due to the outmigration of top talent in India also a bond that's forming between India and lots of other countries too? In other words, is it just the US and India that have a special relationship, or is it India and Brazil, India and Japan, India and England? Because I'm sure India and England's got to be in there somewhere, because there's a long history there.
I'll answer that very quickly.
Okay.
If it was just the numbers, Indians and the Chinese would be very linked. They are not.
Okay.
There is the Himalayas in between, and there's too much ice and snow.
Mm-hmm.
So no one wants to climb the mountain and look over the pass and say, oh, there are humans on both sides, you know. So it's not simply a numbers game. And yes, up to a point it is, because India's got 1.2 billion people, America has got 300 million. But remember, the Indian numbers are misleading. A lot of those people don't have any internet. They live in villages. They might be illiterate. In fact, a lot of them are undernourished. I don't know the latest numbers, but some estimates are that up to 40% of the kids born in India are born underweight. So when you're talking of 1.2 billion, that's just a number you can't bandy around. Actually, numbers with connectivity are actually pretty small. So to answer your question, first, what is the secret of Indian talent? Mm-hmm. The middle classes and the educational culture. Mm-hmm. I don't think the state, and when I closed my speech and said, when will DC catch up, I should have said, when will Delhi catch up? Because Delhi is possibly one of the most, no, definitely, not possibly, one of the most corrupt countries on the planet, one of the most corrupt cities on the planet, full of an entitled elite, which does not respond to the concerns of the wide nation that it governs, and which stymies the economy by being very protectionist, like not opening up, let's say, to American law firms, which would benefit the US economy and, more importantly, the Indian economy, because all the young lawyers don't want to go and work in feudal servitude to the oligopoly that runs India's legal system. So the point which I'm making, the aside why I had to go and bash Delhi a little bit, is because India's strength does not come from a great state school system. It does not come from an efficient government. It does not come from any policy, really. Yes, initially the stroke of genius was to start IITs, etc. But the strength for it comes from the fact that education is culturally prized. It's an ancient culture where learning is prized. It's the same in China, the Confucian culture. If you cleared the exam, you became a mandarin. Okay? You served, and it was a meritocratic exam, so the Chinese have this tradition of learning, sometimes rote learning. But you know, some learning is better than no learning. And the Indians have the same. So there is this pressure. If you're a young kid in India, you said, people will say, oh, look at X, he's very smart, he knows all the tables. If you're a young kid in America, you're probably cool if you're good looking or good at sport, you know, which is great, but doesn't help your economy that much. That is the strength of India, I would say, the educational culture, and that gives India the hunger. And it's very much an individual, or let's say a family-based cultural trait. The second element, you say, the connection between numbers, India and Brazil, India and UK. So I'll answer that. Look, Indians want to come to the US. The best of the Indians, and there are Indians sitting here, correct me I'm wrong, he's there, he's from JNU, which is India's finest humanities university, which I think should be better administered, but that is a different question. But he's from JNU, and he's here. And the best of the Indians want to come to the States. With Brazil, it's a language issue, and Brazil doesn't have universities that attracts them. And also, it's just unknown. It's too new a relationship. With England, there is this huge distrust in colonial. The long past is actually a dividing factor, because the more proud and the more ambitious of Indians don't want to go in a system where there is, at the end of the day, subterranean racism and class ceilings. And that is why I didn't stay on in England. I was a scholar at Oxford, and I didn't stay on in England. I'm here. And I can tell you a lot of us are here. We didn't stay on in England. So I think the connections between India and the UK are not that deep because there's a social divide. Culturally, the Indians and the Americans get along. I mean, there are differences, but they get along because they're open societies, they like movies, you know, they go out and eat pizza and ice cream. So there's a cultural fit, and at the end of the day, the US is the most meritocratic society for all its faults. If you come here and you do work hard and you do well, you go up. And Indians who come here work hard and do well, and so it becomes a virtuous cycle. So you can either get into a vicious cycle, which is you distrust each other, then you play games, then you distrust each other even more, and then you're all the time suspecting each other. Or you can get into the virtuous cycle. And I think in the political sphere, Delhi and Washington, D.C. are in a vicious cycle. In the social and economic and cultural sphere, there is a virtuous cycle. People come here, they do well. I mean, when I was growing up, my cousins here, or my father's cousin had immigrated here, and he had become CEO. And so that was a very potent signal and a symbol for us that the US was a country where if you managed to get to, and you managed to work hard, you could fulfill your potential. And that huge cultural, signal, which the US still has, which is weakening now actually, was one of those things that led to a lot of goodwill amongst the Indian middle classes for America, notwithstanding what Delhi did. Because Indians didn't immigrate to the USSR even when the political elite in Delhi was basically polishing the shoes of the Soviet Union. They came here. And that people, you have to see how people vote with their feet, not what they say, what they do. And they came here.
So the bond is real and it's unique.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can comment on your second questions. We basically grew up watching American movies, cartoons and all, and
Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck.
Indians basically fantasizes America. And I stayed in Delhi for the last 10 years. There's an NCR, it's called Gurgaon, where all the outsourcing has been done, and they basically, that sections follows blindly Americans, even some of them have not visited till yet. the first language is English. They go for movies. They have enormous amount of money. They go for shopping. They use card.
They go to the mall now. Shopping malls is big,
like
big in India. They're being built all over.
Malls, and like you feel like America. They're like skyscrapers, the real estate, and the so much of development. So and with other countries, I think that language is the main issue because Indians generally don't want to learn Chinese and other like Japanese, that kind of languages, and we are more into like America than maybe Europe. That's the and it's really like you can see all the McDonald's and all kind of American food. So
Kentucky Fried Chicken as well.
Yeah, like Subway and all. Like so that's why when I came here, I didn't feel much difference because I stayed in Delhi. Like it's now like very much like any other American city. It's so much of development now. The metro is superb, everything. So that's the connection. It's basically
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
You had a question.
Would you comment, American fast food as ambassadors aside, would you comment about the IMF legacy as it concerns current Indian entrepreneurs in India and foreign direct investment in India?
What do you mean by that? Are you saying that entrepreneurship in India is a direct result or definitely benefited from IMF unshackling the Indian economy? Is that what?
No, it's a genuine question.
Is that your point? I know it's a genuine question.
I do not know the history of the IMF impact, the IMF sanctions on India and
not sanctions.
Structural reform.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how you think that would continue to impact Indian entrepreneurs and foreign direct investment.
So here's what I'd say. The 1991 reforms have played out. Those were a great thing. The IMF has gone wrong in many cases, but in 1991, they managed to get it right. That is also because India is naturally an entrepreneurial country. People forget till the 17th century, it was the second largest economy in the world. A lot of Indian poverty is, thanks to our wonderful friends, the Brits. When you have tax rates that are really high and all the tax goes to London, it's not hard to make a country poor in 200 years. You got rid of them quickly. You were sharper. You had no taxation without representation. So that's what the Indians tried to learn from, but it took us from 1885 to 1947 to get rid of the Brits. So aside, India is naturally an entrepreneurial country with the middle classes having good technical skills and good education. So India was primed for trade. Indians don't like to fight. That's why Pakistan can invade India all the time and get no reaction. Indians want to be left alone in peace so that they can eat ice cream, go to the movies, and make money. Fundamentally, it's as simple as that. They want to avoid a fight if they can help it. That's generally the Indian mentality. I mean, that's why the Indian freedom movement was non-violent. So to answer your question, what was the impact of the IMF? Well, it's played out. The IMF reforms opened up the economy. It led to a release of entrepreneurial energy. It led to the services industry growing. And now what is needed is a further dose of reforms. And now India is rich enough that it doesn't need the IMF. In fact, the IMF needs India now. But for a further growth, India will have to make sure that it doesn't go from a socialist country to a crony capitalistic country. What is happening is you have privatization, but you have it without a proper regulatory framework, without any sense of due process or justice. You have a system wherein the judiciary is crumbling. You have a system wherein a lot of people who, a lot of indigenous tribes who have lived in the forests are being dispossessed and have revolted. You have insurgency in a third of the district. So India has massive problems. And what India needs to keep growing sustainably, to have an economy that is actually sturdy and has a big base, is a fresh dose of reforms. For instance, the 1956 Companies Act needs to go. If I still want to start a company in India, it's a pain. The only reason Indians do well is because there is such ferocious entrepreneurial drive. But the Indian government sets every roadblock in the way it can. And so we don't do well because of the government. We do well in spite of it. And what we need is, we need some of those roadblocks out of the way. We need a better regulatory system. We need a more transparent, more accountable, and more honest government. We need less corruption. There's a huge menu list. The 19th century regulatory framework of India needs to go. You need Parliament to actually stop throwing chairs at each other and actually sit down and draft some bloody laws. Some laws that are in tune with the times and are actually efficient, rational, and far-sighted. So I don't see IMF as having any role in the country now. It did in '91, and that was great. Yeah.
Going off the role of FDI, foreign direct investment, would you say that speaking on in terms of the regulations and the new reforms that need to occur, that it was a good decision for the Parliament to stymie the idea of FDI in terms of retail within India currently, or do you think that that was a backwards move that will shift India backwards?
It's a specific question, and I personally think that retail markets need to be opened up, certainly. But having said that, India has a huge issue of employment, and so some safeguards need to be built in. Unfortunately, like most things in India, it got melodramatic, and the government is under pressure because of, I mean, if you steal $40 billion and then get found out, you're under pressure. That's what's happened to the Indian government. It's been stealing like no tomorrow. And now what it is facing is that it is a situation where it has no political capital. So it has to capitulate to every protest. Is it a backward step? Yes. But I think there are, retail aside, I think there are more important issues in India. How do you acquire land? That is a big thing. It has to be legal. It has to be just. It has to make sure that there is due process. How do you get permits? How do you have a transparent process when you have some privatization? Because privatization, in theory, you know, this is where any ideology is dangerous, whether it is socialism or whether it is neoliberalism. You know, you have to be suspicious of ideology because people say, oh, privatization is good, it'll lead to efficiency. Yes, but that is the big but which no one says. But if done correctly. So if, let's say you have a system wherein the state owns everything, and you come to power and you decide you like Rebecca because she's pretty and she's blonde, and you decide you're going to give her, you know, the assets which are worth $100 for $1, that is a fraud. And so you've got to figure out how do you move from a very regulated society wherein there is a huge overhang of the state to a more efficient, equitable, and truly competitive economy. That is the million-dollar question. So there are lots of things to figure out. And yes, retail is a specific issue, but there are bigger fish to fry there.